Welcome to the Shudder. This is a collection of encounter stories. I'm calling this the Fireside Collection. I put together stories from all over the U.S. Several suggested doing a longer video, so here it is as requested. Shout out to Botetourt, I hope I pronounced that right, buddy, for that. And I'd like to tell little Blakely and Paisley that I'm so glad you like listening to the stories, and always mind your grandmother. Okay, without further ado, throw those 17 pillows you keep on the bed for decoration on the floor and settle in. Myself and 3 friends went coon hunting one night. We were running dogs, 3 black and tan coonhounds. It was a full moon in the late fall of the year, and we had just been running the dogs in a 40-acre section, one of the largest sections in the woods in this area. When the moon rose, there was not much sense in hunting anymore because the coons lay up when the full moon is out. So the 4 of us were walking the dogs out, heading back to the truck to load up and call it a night. All at once, the dogs took off running. A few moments later, we heard a lot of commotion coming from their direction. By the way, I was the only one that didn't have a light or a dog. The guys that owned the dogs took off after them. I heard the dogs yelping like I'd never heard before. You could hear the fear in them by the way they sounded. I was left standing in the middle of a cornfield with corn still in it. Suddenly, I could hear this blood-curdling scream that just kept screaming, and I could tell it was headed my way. I could hear the guys behind this screaming, yelling at their dogs, trying to settle them down. Whatever this was, it was heading my way, and it sounded like a tank crashing through the corn. I turned and started running as hard as I could, and this thing was gaining on me very fast. Whatever this was, it was coming right up the path I was making through the corn. I couldn't run anymore, so I turned to face whatever this was, screaming and coming on me very quick. It didn't take but a few seconds, and there it was. I was scared to death. It ran right into me and knocked me down. When I first saw it come through the corn, it was bent over with a deer around its shoulder and neck. When it ran me over, it dropped the deer, and I mean it was gone in a flash. I was dazed and had the wind knocked out of me. The deer it dropped was still alive. The back bottom part of its leg was twisted almost completely off. It was a spiked buck, I believe. I couldn't really tell because its antlers were busted off. This deer just laid there. The other guys heard me screaming and this thing screaming, and they were coming on the run with the dogs. When they got to me, they helped me up. They thought the deer and I had run into each other. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. One of the guys was my brother. He said the dogs had run into deer before, but never had they acted that way. We had the deer to take care of, so we radioed the game warden, and I told him what happened. He just looked at me like I was crazy, because I was still pretty shaken up. The warden said that the deer must have got caught up in the fence and twisted its leg off. I told him there was no fence. Well, anyway, that's what he put in his report. The warden shot the deer and filled out some paperwork, then released the deer to us. My brother and I took the deer home and dressed it out. Its back leg was not only twisted, the hip bone was pulled out of socket and its back was broken. The antlers were broken off as well. The deer weighed about 150 pounds, but the meat was so bruised we couldn't do anything with it. There were no cuts in the deer, like when they're hit by a car. This deer had been beaten badly. My brother agreed something had got a hold of it, something big, the way its leg was twisted and its back all busted. I took being made fun of for quite a few years over this. No one believed me, and they were right there in the same area with me. I definitely believe what ran over me that night was a Bigfoot. My friend and I were fishing along the Rocky River in the Rocky River Reservation. Wow, that's a lot of R's. We were up on a rock wall that was about 8 feet above the river. We had been fishing there about 2 hours when we saw a herd of deer cross the river away from us. About 5 minutes later, we could see something moving around in the woods directly across from where we were sitting. The river at this part of the reservation is about 20 feet across. I just figured it was the deer and continued to fish. Then I realized that if that was a deer, it would have to be really tall and standing on its hind legs. It looked as though it was trying to eat leaves off the trees. The sunlight caught its eyes, and I could tell it was looking forward at us with these glowing reddish-orange eyes. Glowing from the sunlight, I'm not implying it was possessed scary demon or something. As I was trying to figure out what this thing was doing, I realized it was starting to make its way out of the woods. This is when my friend and I realized it was not a deer at all. A large black image that was standing on two legs started to appear through the trees. My friend took off with her fishing gear at this point and went to her car. I continued to stand there in disbelief of what I was seeing. It stood there at the base of the woods looking at me. I could see this creature standing plain as day, 20 feet across the river from me. It was well over 6 feet tall and had black fur from head to toe. Once I realized what I was looking at, I grabbed my fishing gear and took off across the field to my friend's car. I even tripped and fell over at one point and peed my pants in fear that it may have been chasing me because I started running. Once I got in the car, I asked my friend what she saw, and she said she wasn't sure, but what she was sure of is she was never going to Rocky River Reservation again. My husband was telling a friend what I saw at the reservation. He was actually doing so because he was making fun of me. When he told this person about the incident, he looked at my husband almost confused and started to laugh. He said that he and his girlfriend were walking a path near that area. He said she pointed into the woods and said, "Did you see that monkey?" He says he never saw anything, but his girlfriend swears to this day she saw an ape-like creature running on all fours through those woods. It was unusually warm to be mid-December. Me and my buddy were hunting in an area we'd hunted for years. It was about an hour before sunset when we climbed down, and I met my buddy in a little holler about 100 yards from our stands. We were walking back to the four-wheeler when we heard a very low rumble in the holler we had just met in. We were about 35 yards from the holler, almost in a field, so we thought we would be real still and sit on the edge of the field for a minute and see if we could hear anything else. At this point, we were thinking it was just a grunt or a blow from a deer that we had scared. We waited about 10 minutes before we heard a loud splash in a little drinking hole. We both looked at each other and said, "What the heck was that?" So we waited another minute, still hoping that a deer would come out. Then we heard a second splash. At this point, we realized it wasn't a deer. We got up and walked about 20 yards and saw what we believe was a Bigfoot. It was about 8 feet tall, and I would say it weighed about 400 to 450 pounds, just guessing. My friend and I were almost in shock at what we had seen. The Bigfoot saw us and actually didn't seem to care that we were watching it. It kind of just lingered around the area for another minute before walking over a small ridge where we lost sight of it, and to be honest, we were too scared to go and look for it. We went back to the house and told everyone there. Of course, they said we were crazy, and it was just a bear. I had been hunting bear for years, and I am familiar with their movements. This was no bear. I know this because it never dropped down on all fours the whole time we watched it, and we probably saw it walk a total of 30 or 40 yards. I am 100% sure it was no bear. It was some sort of human ape creature. My friend and I are both positive it was a Bigfoot. I live in a retirement community known as Fairfield Glade in the Cumberland Plateau in East Tennessee. Knoxville is the nearest large city and is 65 miles east. Our little community is surrounded on 3 sides by a state forest and the Catoosa Wildlife Refuge. We have an overabundance of protected wildlife of all kinds, including too many deer, in my opinion, that venture at will into our community. Always the bold tomboy, I preferred to get my exercise by hiking the heavily forested back roads and trails near our home instead of playing golf as my husband did. I never hiked more than 6 miles from home, and always in the early morning. One morning, I was about 4 miles from my home when I came upon an unexpected sunny clearing that seemed to have been an old road or a path at one time because it was grassy and void of underbrush or trees. On my hikes, I am normally under a full canopy of very tall trees, so the sunlight was an unexpected pleasure. As I rounded a curve and my eyes caught the filtered sunlight from the clearing, I observed a large, ape-like creature jump from the woods and pounce at something on the ground. I abruptly froze. In a flash, the creature stood back up, holding a long snake by the head. Just as quick as this happened, the creature disappeared back into the cover of the woods alongside the clearing. I remained still for a moment, contemplating whether the animal had seen me and how best to protect myself. I literally heard my heart beating. I quickly ruled out tree climbing and decided the only alternative was to turn in the opposite direction and run as fast as my legs would carry me. I ran nearly all the way home. I was disturbed by what I had seen and decided that no one would believe it, so I never told anyone. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, and my husband has passed since then. Over the years, I have tried to convince myself that I really didn't see the thing that has so frightened me that morning in the woods. I tried to convince myself that I somehow imagined it. However, the vivid memories persist. To this day, I have never set foot in any woods again, essentially breaking a very long-standing and much revered habit till that day. I am still fearful of seeing that creature again. I've always been a sober-minded individual, not at all given to making up fantasies or stretching the truth as I know it. I was completely caught off guard and stunned the other day when an ad spot for your show came across my screen. After watching your show, I am now convinced that I actually did see what I thought I saw that day on my last hike. Your show also brought to mind the night a few years ago. This happened well after my experience in the woods. My husband and I were sitting on our deck looking up at the stars, so clearly visible up here in the dark woods of the Cumberland Plateau. We were quietly listening for the whippoorwill who nests every year in the woods across our street. He calls relentlessly for a mate every night during season. Piercing through the peace and tranquility, we heard the most horrific, deep, bellowing scream from what seemed like some distance away. We had both been leaning way back in our lawn chairs admiring the night sky and almost fell out of our chairs in shock. I remember my husband abruptly stood up and said we should go inside, and he added that he had never seen a mountain lion big enough to scream like that. I did not make the mental connection to the scream we heard and the creature I had seen a few years prior until I heard the same type of scream on one of your shows. I must confess that I am a reluctant convert, but I am now convinced there is a Bigfoot living in the woods of Cumberland Plateau. In August of 1998, my younger sister and I were on our way back from the hospital. She was 20 and I was 23. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. when we finally hit County Line Road, just outside of where my mother lives. We were both staying with her at the time of the sighting. My mother lives in Buckley, about 6 miles down County Line Road. We were about a mile or so away, just talking and making jokes. We were both very tired. I turned to say something to her, and when I looked back to the road, I saw a tall thing literally take 2 steps, and it was across the road. It stood about 7 or 8 feet tall. As soon as we saw it, we both jumped and said, "Did you see that?" We immediately knew what we both saw and raced back to our mom's house. Once we were back home, we recalled the details. We were finishing each other's sentences, which was very disturbing, knowing we recollected the same thing. It still seems funny to think about, but the thing had long flowing hair. It actually looked groomed. The hair was all over its body, and it was brown with silverish tips. The arms were very long and hung down just above its knees. The head was placed down between its shoulders. We didn't see the face. We laugh about it now and still get chills, especially when we both recall how the thing was walking like it had someplace to be. It was the strangest thing. We both agreed that it was walking in haste, not as if it were trying to get away from something or someplace, rather almost like a person would walk hastily on a city street when they were late for a job or an appointment or something like that. I haven't seen anything like that since, but I'm always looking when I get around by Mom's place. This October, just after my birthday, it was getting chilly in the late afternoon. My friend and I were bored, so we decided to go walking around in the woods adjacent to my home, which was a one-room schoolhouse my stepdad was remodeling. We did these walks often, looking for cool places to build forts or just exploring. This time, we went further back through an old apple orchard, and that's when it happened. As we were walking, we both noticed it was really quiet. No sounds of birds or animals at all. We were a little amazed at the silence. Then, the wind picked up a little, which blew the leaves around. There was still a lot on the trees, but the leaves blowing broke the silence, so we started to move on. I had this weird feeling of being watched. I told my friend, and he said he had it too. At that moment, we both heard this loud thumping crunch. "Did you hear that?" I said. He nodded yes, afraid to talk because it was loud and close, just about 50 feet away. It was like something had stomped the ground. I said it sounded like it came from over there, and as I pointed to the direction of the noise, we both saw this big, upright animal covered in hair. It immediately moved into the deep brush and trees while making this deep kind of throated noise, like, ugh. All we could see was the back, the butt, and the left leg going into the bush. It wasn't crouching, it was upright, like it was just walking by. I started running, not thinking of my friend. I ran as fast as I could to my house, which was about 350 feet away, through dense brush, partial swamp, and a trail. When I stopped, my friend was right there, which surprised me, because I thought I could run faster than him. This thing's leg was at least as tall as me. I was about 5'4" at 14 years old. It was dark reddish with some gray in it, about 3 or 4 inches long. The fur was super thick, and its leg was thicker than my body. Out of the blue, my friend recently visited me. We haven't seen each other since high school, and we're both in our 40s now. One of the first things he asked me was, "Do you remember what we saw behind your house?" I told him, yeah, we saw a Bigfoot, and I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life, not even when I was in the Marines. Ever since we saw it and know they live out there among the trees, I've always been watchful for these critters. One night, around 11 p.m., my sister-in-law ran into my mother-in-law's house from outside and said that she had seen something very tall walking on the trail below the house. She said it was walking back and forth on the trail before it came up to the house and stood at the corner looking at them just sitting there. That's when she and her friend ran inside and told us. We checked outside around the front, but saw nothing, so they went in her room after that. Me and my girlfriend stayed in the living room and watched TV. A short time later, we heard some noise in the dining room. It sounded like rustling on the floor. I jumped up to go see what it was, and some of the girls came out to see what the noise was too. It was like somebody throwing stuff around in the room. When I got to the dining room, I saw a large hand reaching in the window. It reached across the table by the window and pulled out a bowl that had some fruit in it. We were all terrified. I called the conservation office, and they drove out to investigate. Nothing else happened after that. This thing has been hanging around this town for about 2 or 3 years now. About 2 years before that, a Bigfoot followed my brother-in-law home from a friend's house late one night. He saw it down the road, about 150 yards away. He got scared and ran home. When he got to the door, he started pounding on it. He didn't know it had followed him, and when he looked behind him, he saw that the Bigfoot was standing there looking at him about 10 feet away. When they opened the door, my brother ran inside. He said the thing hung around and then left after about 5 minutes. Another incident was about a year ago at the same house. My mother-in-law went out to get her clothes off the line. There was snow on the ground. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. She saw 2 sets of tracks, a very large set and a smaller set. They went between the house and the clothesline, and some of her clothes were on the ground. The tracks went down to the trees below her house and disappeared into the forest. Now, I live in a trailer home up the highway. The closest house is about a mile away. One time, I could hear loud screams coming from the canyon over from where I live. A few nights later, me and my girlfriend were going to bed, and we heard a sound like a rumble on the side of our room. It was like somebody bumped our trailer with a car. It only happened once, but I figured it was a Bigfoot since we've seen it and heard it around here so many times before. In May of 1983, while camping in the Santa Fe National Forest in northern New Mexico, I experienced a most peculiar visitation. I was 30 years old at the time and a trade school student in Albuquerque. I was part of a student group from the Southwest Indian Polytechnic Institute in Albuquerque. We were camping fairly high up in the mountains on a student activity prior to the end of the school year. Our student advisor was Mr. Ray from Pueblo Acoma, New Mexico. Early that morning at around 4 a.m., I was asleep in my own tent, alone, when I was actually awakened by an awful stench. This foul odor was so powerful, the scent burnt my nostrils. I sat up in my sleeping bag just in time to see a massive, light-brown, hairy arm reach into the tent through the front flap and start to feel around. Totally horrified, I started to hyperventilate, as this huge arm clearly was not human. Just as I was about to scream my lungs out, the arm drew back and out of the tent. I was strangely aware that there were 2 creatures right outside my tent, as I heard 2 separate and distinct vocalizations, one male and one female. Through the dim outside light and through the tent material, I could make out at least 2 figures, possibly 8 feet in height. The next thing I heard were these 2 beings yelling loudly as they ran away from my tent. I stayed awake until sunrise and was so enthralled by what had happened that I could not bring myself to tell anyone about this event. And at breakfast, no one else there was talking about any similar occurrence. I have never told anyone about this until earlier this year. I am certain these 2 creatures had to be the Bigfoot people that so many had reported seeing before. Two friends and I were backpacking on Great Northern Mountain in the winter of 2002. It was our second night. We reserved a stone cabin from the PATC named Sugar Knob Cabin. We had not seen anyone all day. There was an ice storm coming, and we attributed it to that. We made a fire outside the cabin just before dusk while it was still nice out. We began hearing slow-moving, very heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of the cabin. We thought it was a bear or a deer, but it was clearly on 2 feet by the sound it was making. We called out to see if it was a poacher or just someone walking around, but no response was given. This is a pretty remote spot and definitely not very visited in the winter months. The walking sounds continued, but because the sun was down, we couldn't see too far into the woods. We all heard the walking sounds for quite a while, and it really freaked us out, so we abandoned the fire and pretty much locked ourselves inside the cabin. All of us had a lot of outdoor experience and had backpacked a lot as well. We had never heard or experienced anything like this before. The sounds got closer once inside the cabin. It is a stone cabin, so it's fairly well insulated from noise, so whatever it was large. The footsteps seemed to stop and continue for maybe an hour or so. We made dinner inside, and after we ate, the footsteps were right next to the cabin. There was a window opposite the door with the wood shutters on the blinds. I walked over and opened them, expecting to see a person, but all we witnessed was a dark, very hairy, large face looking at us about a foot outside the window. We were terrified, shaking and speechless. The creature took off after a few seconds of seeing us, and vice versa. We never heard any more sounds after that, though we stayed up late, kind of standing guard. The next morning we awoke to ice everywhere and could not find any tracks or evidence of what we saw and heard. We hiked down the Stony Creek Trail to the cars as fast as we could without getting hurt on the icy ground. There was a cabin journal at the time, and we read it over that night after the incident and read several accounts that were similar to ours. We never stayed there again, and this is the first time I have ever told this. I did not want people to think we were nuts, but seeing so many tell their story, I had to get mine out there. A group of us from Roanoke, Virginia were on our annual football season camping trip in the George Washington National Forest. We did this every fall as a treat after a tough season of high school football. We were in the North Creek campground about 10 or 15 miles north and east of Buchanan, Virginia, an area called Arcadia between the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Appalachian Trail, and Interstate 81. We had the luck of getting what we called the Sportsman's Shelter, one of only two in the area, provided on a first-come, first-served basis. There were 7 of us, and it was Saturday night. The shelter was a 3-sided shelter with a wooden floor and raised about 3 feet off the ground. In front of the open side is the area for a campfire. We had gone to bed around 11:30 or so. Sometime around midnight, I was awakened by a strong stench and a presence inside the shelter with us. We were all in sleeping bags, side by side, with our heads against the rear wall and facing the large fire we had going in front of the shelter. What I saw made me freeze. I could not move, even though I wanted to. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't speak. The animal was standing on its hind legs, and because the fire was directly behind it, I could see the silhouette of a tall, 7-foot, hairy, ape-like figure. I remember the hair covered it from head to toe, but could not make out any facial features because the light was behind it. After a short time, I felt a liquid splash my face, and it took me a moment to realize that it was urinating between myself and the guy next to me. Actually, it was urinating on the guy's sleeping bag that was next to mine. The smell was very strong and pungent. When this thing finished, it stepped off the shelter floor and disappeared. It literally took about 30 seconds to a minute to come out of what I can only describe as a paralysis. My friend Tim woke up the same time, yelling that someone had urinated on him, and was truly upset. He had thought it was one of the other guys pulling a prank. By now, everyone was awake, and it was obvious that no one else had done this. When I explained what I had seen, we decided to move from the shelter, which was isolated, to a campground about a quarter-mile away where there were more people. We were all pretty big guys, all football players, and pretty tough, I guess. But whatever happened that night scared us enough to break camp and move. I haven't been comfortable in the woods at any time ever since. I just found your site and do not remember all the details of my sighting, but here is the best I can remember of the night I saw something on Cabbage Hill in Oregon. It was December, right around Christmas. I was driving a truck and trailer going back to Texas from Portland, Oregon. My co-driver was asleep when I saw this thing cross the highway on top of Cabbage Hill at about 1:30 a.m. I came around a small curve, and it looked as surprised as I was. I stopped with it in my headlights, and it stopped right in front of me as I almost hit it. I sat and watched it stare at me through the windshield. I was driving a Peterbilt long-nosed tractor, which, as I recall, the top of the hood is about 6.5 feet from the ground to the top. This creature was head and shoulders above the top of the hood as it looked at me. It was blondish brown in color. had bright yellowish red eyes, and was not as mean looking as some have told in the TV shows that try to scare you about it. It had some hair, but it was not as hairy as a bear. I thought at first it might be a bear that had been losing its hair. It had very human-like features, and its nose was very large and human-like. Its mouth was formed like a human's, but its teeth were a bit longer, but not like fangs. Its belly button was long and deep. It had an innie. It walked like an old man with a backache, kind of bent slightly forward and stiff. Its arms were longer than a man's, but it did not look like a gorilla with arms too long for its body. I remember thinking to myself that this must be some sort of mutant bear or something. It seemed mad that I was invading its space. It straightened up and slapped the top of the hood right above the radiator with open hands, like it was warning me to leave it alone. I woke my co-driver, but he only saw it as it ran into the woods away from the highway where I sat, wishing I had a camera to take a picture to show everyone this thing I had seen. Back in the winter of 2001, my youngest son and I were on our way from Boise, Idaho to Medford, Oregon. We had taken a car trailer to his old place in Boise in order to haul his non-running Jeep to his new place in Medford. We hit an area of heavy snow in the southern Cascades around 2 a.m. It took 45 minutes or so to get down the mountain. We had, of course, been drinking coffee to stay alert. About 25 miles west of the pass, it became obvious that the last few quarts of coffee had to be drained, so we stopped at a wide spot in the road near a summer tourist haunt that's deserted in winter. There's a gas station and ice cream joint on the west side of the road that were closed and no town or settlement within 30 miles of us. This is timber country and unsettled. Across the road is a small parking area about 200 feet wide and 80 feet deep. I pulled in, and as I stepped out, it occurred to me in a flash that grabbing the 590 Mossberg would be a good idea. As we walked to the far end of the area to be well off the road, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. The area directly ahead of us was open. The night was clear and cold. There was 8 to 10 inches of snow on the ground, and with an almost full moon, so we could see quite well. We were standing there taking a leak. My son was about 15 feet to my right. I saw, as if springing from the earth in front of us across the open area, 10 or 12 creatures moving rapidly back and forth in sort of a thatch weave pattern. These things did not look like human men and were close to 7 feet tall, thin, bipedal with long arms, medium-length gray fur, and very fast on their feet. I brought the shotgun up and slid the safety off as my son was drawing his .45. I don't know if I can adequately explain the overwhelming feeling of menace, but here goes. I had been operating on pure instinct since I had stepped out of the pickup. The rotten feeling hit me a split second before the things arrived. The feeling was that we were prey and subject to a very bad death. To be slaughtered and eaten was not a logical process, just a bad gut feeling, and massively overwhelming. As they were moving about in front of us, more appeared and mixed among them, all the while running about fast in front of us. My son and I were backing toward the truck. I would not present my back to them. Some of them peeled off right and left. It appeared they were circling us. They were rolling in fast from the sides now. I could smell and feel their presence. We got to the truck, loaded on adrenaline and ready to kill, because we both knew we were in grave danger. We piled into the truck and locked the doors. I had keys out and ready. As my butt neared the seat, I had the engine lit, transmission in gear, and gas pedal mashed in one motion. Adrenaline is great stuff. As we fled, something very close by let out a ululating scream. I believe one or more of the group had gotten really close to us in their pursuit, and I had run over the foot of one of them. Yeah, they were that close. We rolled onto the highway, and I told my son to watch the bed of the pickup as well as the trailer. He already was indexed to the rear with the shotgun. We hauled butt for at least 20 miles before the feeling of grave danger started to abate. The feeling that nailed both of us, as we discussed soon afterwards, was one of being prey and soon to be slaughtered and eaten. I'm not easily led, neither believe or disbelieve all the Bigfoot, ghost, and werewolf stuff. In fact, I'm skeptical. My son was speaking with a coworker about 6 months later who had grown up in Prospect, Oregon, about 30 miles south of Union Creek, where the incident took place. He asked Jake if he had ever heard of any strange goings-on in the area. Jake went ashy white and pretty much told the above tale. He said to avoid that place at night. A friend of his, a 25-year retired cop, not given to flights of fancy and an excellent observer, had a tale very similar from a year before. I had told my wife of this event, and at first she looked at me as though I had developed a third eyeball in the center of my forehead. She was shocked, of course. She did believe me, but did not wish to hear any details. She said the tale gave her the chills. Me too. As I write this, the hair on the back of my neck and forearms is sticking up. I have not gone back to explore, and would not, without a large group of shotgun and flamethrower-equipped men with me. My son and I are both sane, sober people, and not taken to hysteria. We were wide awake as things transpired. We saw and smelled what was there. As a sidebar, neither of us heard footfalls from the creatures. They were silent until I heard one as we were getting the heck out of there. To my knowledge, and I have researched, there is nothing that matches these creatures, unless one considers the old legends and folk tales of were-creatures. To conclude, I have to fall back on Elmer Keith's famous line, "Hey, I was there." Best regards, Mike. Ooh, did I save the best for last? I think I did. I may be putting more of these longer videos together for you, and I just want to say that I know the ads are annoying, but I don't place those. YouTube places those ads. That's why I provide chapter markers so the algorithm will place them there and not to interrupt the story. It's my only source of income during this quarantine, and I really appreciate the support you all have given over these past 2 months. It's just been fantastic. So I'm going to be putting some more of these together for you guys really soon. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and if you subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can join me here next time for the Shudder.